Thank you very much, Professor Heck. I think we've really hit the jackpot in terms of 4 excellent presentations today that are extremely informative. I have 12 questions, but unfortunately we don't have a lot of time. So I'm going to give priority to the audience. If you have any question, please raise your hand. Please be very brief, not more than 1 minute. Introduce yourself and then ask your question. We'll start there at the back. Bill.
Hi, William Lawrence, National Council on U.S. Relations, also affiliated with American.
Is the mic
on? William Lawrence, National Council on U.S. Relations. I'm also affiliated with Georgetown and AU. So my question, first of all, in response to the third speaker, I did a little math here. So there were 4 million people at the dawning of the United States, 700,000 of which were slaves, about a third of which were Muslims, which would have made the early American population about 6% Muslims, which I hadn't figured out until now. And then we can look at the evolution after that. In terms of, I also wanted to mention that the most famous Muslim at the beginning of the United States in Washington was Mahmoud Yarrow, for whom the plaque went up recently. And our friend Asma Khalid Redwan and I know, and I don't know who else knows, there's a new series on American Muslims coming out on PBS, and he's the whole first chapter of that series. So that'll be interesting.
Bill.
In listening to the first speaker, though, and I agreed with all the presentations, but it kind of got me thinking that the opponents to the view that I think everyone here has towards Sharia and democracy, and we've had 4 very different but complementary presentations here, is that the other side isn't only irrational, right? As the first speaker sort of implied. The other side has a lot of irrationality, and there's an irrational debate between irrational people on 2 sides of this debate who feed off each other in a symbiotic way. But there's also rational people on the other side. And I Googled a list of about 20, Muslims and ex-Muslims who are advocating against Sharia law, often more in Europe than in the United States. The most famous is Hirsi Ali, but there's many others. And I don't want to make this about Hirsi Ali. But I would ask the first speaker and then the panel in general, shouldn't we be engaging both with the rational and the irrational people on the other side? Like, shouldn't we be both making these types of arguments that the panel made about educating people about Sharia, while at the same time addressing those issues of racism and colonial issues and bigotry and all that? Because I don't think you can really win the argument if you're not arguing at both levels of the debate coming from the other side.
Okay. We'll take 2 or 3 questions together and then we'll answer them together. Yes, right here. Haytham.
I'm Haytham Al-Khatib, a professor of mathematics at the University of Baltimore. My first question is the real question, not whether Sharia is compatible with democracy, but whether modern democracies are capable of accommodating deeply rooted moral frameworks without marginalizing them. My second question in the US is the anxiety around Sharia primarily legal, or is it more about identity, politics, and perception? And the last question, a few seconds. To what extent is Sharia inherently pluralistic, given its multiple schools of interpretation? And does that pluralism strengthen or weaken its compatibility with democratic systems? Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take a third question over there.
Okay. Sure. Thank you all for this wonderful talk. My name is Nabil Mikhail. I'm a professor of political science. I'm actually also from Egypt. Originally, I come from a Coptic Christian background. And I have 2 questions. Because as a student of politics, I feel that there is a divergence between law and politics. So let us focus at 2 aspects of politics, reflecting both my Egyptian experience and my American experience. I hear often that, okay, if Trump goes away, things will be wonderful for Muslims, and the anti-Sharia campaign, which Professor Khalid from UCLA spoke about early, would basically phase out or disappear. So I want you to comment on this as a case of how law and politics can mix. Second, and I'm old enough to remember President Sadat of Egypt, when Nasser died in September 1970, Sadat came and then he proposed a permanent constitution of Egypt whereby stipulating that Sharia would be the governing principle, المصدر الأساسي للتشريع. Then his actions actually were not congruent with Sharia. Like his wife Jihan, if you recall her, was proposing a marriage law that would empower women tremendously. And he coincided with Israel, and he basically moved the country toward things that could be viewed as non-Islamic. And that actually was one cause why Khalid al-Istanbuli and his entourage killed him. So do you think that Sharia is a ploy, is a political trick, is a political scheme that could be manipulated? So I hope that you can answer me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll take one last question or fourth question. We'll have a second round if you have more questions, but yes.
Yes, thank you
Mr.
so much,
Sanusi.
Dr. Masmoudi. And let me begin by thanking you and Impact and CSID for gathering us in this very, very timely discussion. So I appreciate that. My name is Mohammed Sanusi. I am the Executive Director of the Peacemakers Network and also serve on the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. I really have a couple of questions. One question is basically we can hear the professors what they are saying, and then we can look into our realities as an American Muslim communities, how to actually address this question of Sharia. I would basically, the first question came to Professor Abul Fadl, which is a very important question, is that the aspect of the education. If we are going to label those who are now against Sharia and all of these caucuses and all of that as a racist, I'm not sure that's going to help us as an American Muslim community. I believe education and also removing some of this ignorance about this, and with that kind of intention, it might be more of our interest as an American Muslim community. I have seen this in my actual service right now in the United States Commissions, which is a commission has a very conservative people that are appointed by Speaker Johnson and others. But we are going to have in 2 weeks the first ever hearing on Islamophobia. Never happened in the almost since the law was passed in 1998, which is established the commission. We're gonna have top most expert actually talking about Islamophobia, not in the United States, because our mandate is not to look into religious freedom here in our nation, but abroad. So I think we are making progress as
But can you look at both?
No, we cannot.
No? Okay.
Because the law will say no. So our mandate is to look into what's happening in the 193 countries around the world, but not in the United States, right?
Okay.
There is a, but the point I am trying to make is that engaging and in a discourse, trying to educate people is actually more beneficial for us. We have experience also in the first, 1.0 Trump administration when he was appointed ambassador at large, and what happened, right? And we made the right decision by engaging Tim Kaine and ask him to release the hold so that the ambassador can be confirmed and we engage him. His first trip was where? To the Uyghurs Muslim community, to Rohingyas actually, to the Rohingya Muslim communities in Bangladesh. So engagements and education, I think, is very helpful for us. So we need the professor to help us actually to increase the capacity of those who are activists in the American Muslim community to further engage and educate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mohammed, Dr. Sanusi. We have 4 questions, and the speakers, you can answer any one of them if you want. We'll just keep it short. The answer is like 1 or 2 minutes each, please.
Yeah.
Professor Soman.
Yeah, so obviously I can't do justice to all of the issues raised in the 4 or 5 different sets of questions, but I will mention sort of 2 points. One is there is the question of, well, can religious communities with strong values of their own coexist with modern liberal democratic society? I think the answer is absolutely yes, if government power is kept appropriately and tightly limited, because the more government controls various aspects of our lives, the more government has to make decisions about a vast range of issues related to everything from education to healthcare to family structures and everything else. And obviously, the more government does that, the more inevitably, at least some religious communities is going to trample on them. So if we have a liberal society with tight limits on government power, that is compatible with a pluralism of a wide range of religious and other groups living in accordance with their own principles and values. But in order to achieve that, we have to have tight limits on government power. Obviously, limits I spoke on in my presentation about direct efforts to suppress the free exercise of religion, but also other things as well, which may not be deliberately targeting religion or other minority communities or other types of moral systems, but nonetheless end up trampling on them nonetheless. Then there is a flip side of, can various traditional religions, including traditional Muslims, adherents of Sharia law and so on, can their principles be accepting of liberal democracy? And again, I think a lot depends on the situation and exactly what those groups think their principles are. As I mentioned in my presentation, obviously in the Muslim world, there is no consensus or unified religious authority which says, like, this is the one true version of Sharia law. And I think in the Muslim world, as among Christians and Jews, there are debates between those groups that accept liberal pluralism and limits on government power and so on. And at the other extreme, groups like the Taliban or Hamas and so forth, which pretty obviously don't. And of course, there's intermediate options. So I think a just liberal society can accept a wide range of religious groups and allow them to live their lives as they see fit. But groups that do seek to impose a theocracy or dictatorship and the like, they're going to find that either they're stymied, and for good reason, or hopefully they might find that it would be desirable for them to change some of those ideas, just as there has been evolution among Christians and Jews, caused in part by liberalism and the Enlightenment, where many of them, not all obviously, but many of them have over time shifted. So there is less support in the Christian world today for the Inquisition that was mentioned earlier than there was hundreds of years ago. I won't say no support. There are certainly still Catholic integralists and the like Adrian Vermeule, who do support things like that, but hopefully fewer such people than before. So obviously much more can be said, but I hope I've at least outlined a few relevant points on those 2 big issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Heck?
Sure. Just very briefly, yeah, I think the so-called rational fears come when non-Muslim Americans, they look at the Taliban and they look at ISIS. That's, kind of justifying then what some of these apocalyptic pastors are saying, and then the clash of civilization, right? Sharia is just kind of funneled and weaponized for clash of civilization rhetoric. So, yeah, you got to turn to civil rights and the First Amendment, space for Muslims according to the Constitution, and the fears. You got to point out the fears, but it's not going to change, right? That global situation, right? I mean, when a Baptist minister burns a Quran in Florida, who pays the price? Christians in Pakistan, right? So I guess all I would say is really call our Muslim brothers and sisters to see that you have such a gift to offer the global ummah, right? We Catholics had this issue too. We were suspect, from the Bain amendments to John Kennedy having to go to Houston to explain to the Protestant ministers that he's not against democracy, right? This is a story that repeats itself, and the solution is always when you lean in with the moral contribution, and that's the Islamophobia, the First Amendment rights, but I would just really suggest that the Muslim American community has a real gift to offer the worldwide ummah by showing, how this can work. And I mean, because sometimes what I hear, and Sharia scholars here will know more than I, but sometimes what I hear from Muslims is that the maslaha we want is the maslaha for Muslims. And we Catholics had a phase like that, but now it's like, no, it's only going to work if we want the maslaha for everyone, And just like if you lean in with that and build moral alliances, and it's already happening, but it's a never-ending story, and we're not going to get out of the global situation that online influences use to kind of just heat up the polemics. We're not going to get away from that, but we still have to kind of live according to our convictions. And America has just been a wonderful place for Catholics to show the worldwide Catholic Church that there's another way. And it's going to be a wonderful place for Muslim Americans to show the worldwide Ummah that there's another way. And it's about, showing how Islam here contributes to the moral vigor of the U.S. nation.
Thank you very much. Professor Muhammad Fadel.
Thank you. There's a lot that can be said, but I want to focus on a couple of questions here about let's just say substantive questions about Islamic law. Like I saw some in the chat, and I think Professor Nabil mentioned something about the Sharia being manipulable. That Sadat introduced these constitutional amendments, and then his wife wants to, ignore the Sharia. One issue here, I think, is what do Muslims mean by the Sharia, like from a practical legislative perspective versus a theological perspective. So we generally make a distinction between fundamental doctrines of Islam and what you could say downstream legal rules. So things like quotidian questions of family law, we don't really view these as fundamental doctrinal questions. And so somebody like Sadat, I don't know his soul, so I'm not going to judge his sincerity, right? Can perfectly believe that his wife's suggested reforms are perfectly compatible with the Sharia, because the Sharia does not dictate outcomes at that quotidian level of legislation that we're talking about. Now, one of the questions that came up, oh yes, but the Quran allows men to marry four women. Of course it does. I can't change that. Khalid can't change that. Radwan can't change that. Nobody can change that. But if you look at the history of Islamic law, and I'm a scholar of Maliki fiqh, so that prevailed primarily in North Africa and Andalusia, private ordering resolved that question. So there were standard form marriage contracts that became predominant in Maliki regions, in which a wife contracted for the right to divorce herself if her husband took a second wife, right? And so I think, I as a legal scholar and my colleagues here, we understand law as a dynamic system. And so it's very important to be able to separate theology from quotidian matters of legality. And that's really one of the great insights of the First Amendment, that intolerance was based on the view that you could deduce how everybody would behave based on certain theological commitments. And on that basis, you could exclude Catholics because they owed their ultimate loyalty to the Pope. The First Amendment says, no, you can't do that, right? Because a Catholic is capable of reconciling his fidelity to the church and his duties as a citizen, right? And so this is why I want to sort of emphasize the need for us as American citizens to move beyond the inquisitorial logic of predicting how people will behave based on our understanding of their theology to actually their behavior, their actual real behavior. Now, there's one more thing I wanted to point out. Now, there is this solution. Well, let's just have general applicable law, right? And so if the foreign rule or whatever is incompatible with public policy, then that's good enough. In theory, that's good enough. But still, we have to address the underlying irrational bias against Islamic law. There are numerous cases in the federal reports that indicate that judges have an irrational bias against Islamic law. And when they do have, when they're faced with certain choice of law questions, sometimes they have really weird interpretations of what Islamic law means. And so I wish we could just have neutral choice of law rules and that would solve everything. But it still requires a real, committed sort of education of the legal community into what Islamic law really is. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Abu Fadl?
Thank you. I mean, there's a lot here that one could comment on, but uh, uh, since I've immigrated to the United States in 1982, and what might be considered what one might call the apologetic project. I have watched, I have participated, I have partaken in the apologetic project. An apologetic here doesn't necessarily mean a bad thing, but it's a project of trying to uh, uh, present defenses of the Sharia tradition by explaining it to the other. Typically, it goes something like Muslims insisting that a proper understanding of Sharia would not lead to polygamy. A proper understanding of Sharia would clearly it would clearly indicate that punishing apostasy is not acceptable under true enlightened understanding of Islam. The classical laws that discriminate against women in inheritance or that don't give women adequate rights upon a divorce are not really Islamic, and so on and so forth. And these types of arguments, I mean, when they take place internally between Muslims with a sincere desire to understand God's will, I'm all for that. And I think that they're healthy and they're important. And that these exactly are the discussions that Muslims, in investigating and reflecting and even reconstructing their tradition, as all traditions must go through reconstructive dynamics, are very healthy and they're very good. The problem, though, is that do these apologetic projects do anything when they are offered to? I served on the same religious commission that was mentioned, the Commission for Religious Freedom, and at the time that I served on it, we had Nina Shea. I don't know if any of you have heard of Nina Shea, but she's a very well-known Christian conservative who was serving on the committee. And my entire, the number of years that I served on that commission, there was, the repeated experience of reflecting on whether discourse worked with people with the type of ideological commitments that Nina Shea had. And this is where if someone is interested in my racial outlook or what I mean by racialization of Muslims, you could read Khalid Baidoun or read Sahar Aziz, who've written extensively about this. I tend to agree with Sahar Aziz that the demonization of Muslim culture and Muslim tradition cannot be separated from racial issues. Let me give you the following example. Often, the likes of Robert Spencer or Daniel Pipes or Andrew Boston or Raymond Ibrahim or someone like Walid Shubat, they in fact have written extensively on the importance of being Islamophobic, meaning they anticipate all the defensive arguments that Muslims make about their own tradition. So they will write in this literature, yeah, Muslims will tell you that they don't really support polygamy. Muslims will tell you that they don't really support apostasy laws. Muslims will tell you that they don't really support inequality. Muslims will tell you that they want to reinterpret their tradition so that, but it is, the argument goes, indeed, Muslims, when they do so, they are doing it purely for political ends. And this is, by the way, the same exact arguments used by secular Muslims against quote unquote Islamists in Muslim countries. I can't tell you the number of times I've heard secular Egyptian government officials or Tunisian officials or Jordanian officials or Syrian officials say, you know, yeah, the Islamists are, every reform program presented as Islamists is insincere. They just say that because they want political power and this is their means of negotiating political power. The one time, so before I say that, so the likes of Robert Spencer and Daniel Pipes and Walid Shubat and so on, they actually brag about being Islamophobic. They say, yes, Islamophobic, a smart, intelligent person needs to be Islamophobic because Islam, in fact, is dangerous, because Islam, in fact, is evil. The only time that you get aroused from them, put differently, the one criticism that really bothers them and really or Hershey Ali is a very good example. Hershey Ali is woefully ignorant about it. She's not stupid and not ill-educated, but her ignorance about Sharia arguments are willful and intentional. I've had many dealings with her over the years. Hershey Ali will ignore any argument by quote unquote reformist, modernist Muslims, will ignore any arguments. I've seen her respond to questions about Rashid Ghanouchi and respond to questions about various, I forgot his name now, Al-Yarabi, a Tunisian philosopher, and basically say, oh, they're all liars, basically. These Islamists, they're whatever the narrative they tell you that makes Islam sound reconcilable to liberalism, it's all being stealth, engaging in taqiyya. It's all a big lie. The only time you get aroused from the likes of Hershey Ali is when you tell them what I believe is the truth, that they're racist. In the case of Hershey Ali, she's racist against her own, which is very much something, a common phenomena among those who are colonized. It is not unusual for the colonized to actually become racist against their own, and sometimes even racist against their very self. I don't think we can separate the issue of Islamophobia from the legacy of colonialism, and that's what part of what differentiates anti-Muslim sentiment from anti-Catholic sentiment, for instance, is that, or even anti-Semitic sentiment, because you are hating the disempowered. It's very different than hating those, or bigotry against those who are not colonized. Put differently, the dynamics of hate and the dynamics of race in light of a post-genocidal world that we all lived through, where we all sat around and watched 100,000 Palestinians get massacred, and it is thoroughly different than hating a minority that has not been colonized, that would not be subjugated to a total genocide as the world watches and does absolutely nothing. Uh, if we are serious about addressing this, what I perceive, what I consider to be a cultural deficiency in Western consciousness, and that is the legacy of Islamica in general, including what Edward Said wrote about Orientalism and the Orientalist tradition. I think it's important that we stop skirting around the issue and that we confront it head on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Fadl and all the speakers. I think we're out of time, so I'm just going to make some concluding remarks. I'm sure there are many more questions, but we're going to need a lot more time to answer all the questions. But unfortunately, we're out of time. I agree with Professor Khalid Abul Fadl that a lot of the people behind this anti-Sharia or Islamophobia industry that has been growing in the last, especially 6 months to a year, are racist people and have racist ideology. But I think that does not speak for the majority of the Americans. 80 or 90% of the Americans who may have some anti-Sharia thoughts or Islamophobic thoughts are not necessarily racist, just out of ignorance, is because they don't know anything about Islam or Muslims except what they hear in some of these channels or what they see on TV and things like that. And so I think while I agree with Professor Al-Fadl that there is no point in arguing with the racist segment because they are just racist, there is no logic to their argument, and they don't really are not looking for the truth. There is a lot of value in engaging in dialogue and education with the majority of the American people to educate them about really what Sharia is, what Islam is, what Muslims really believe. And I think it's on us as Muslims that we have really fallen short in the last 30 years or 40 years that I've been in this country since 1981. We have done a really poor job of reaching out to our American neighbors and really explaining to them and making progress. We've done a little bit, but it's far from enough to educate our and therefore it's our responsibility, and it's also our fault that they misunderstand Islam or misunderstand Sharia, because they look at ISIS or they look at Daesh or Taliban in Afghanistan, and in their mind that's Sharia. Of course they're going to be against it. I'm against it. If that's what Sharia is, what Taliban is doing in Afghanistan or ISIS and Daesh are doing in Iraq and Syria and elsewhere, then of course we are all against it. But that's not really the true meaning of Islam or the true meaning of Sharia. And these extremists do not represent Islam or Islamic thought or Islamic. So it's really on us, in my opinion, on MPAC, on CSID, and many other Muslim organizations in this country to really educate the American public and the American policymakers. Muhammad Fadl, you have something to add?
Sorry, I just really want to just
Please go
respond
ahead.
very quickly. I wish it could be reduced to the Taliban or ISIS or whatever. The historical roots are just way too deep.
Right.
I mean, if you look at colonialism, the rhetoric of colonial rulers was always about the danger of Muslims governing themselves. Islamophobia is ultimately a denial of Muslims of the right to govern themselves, whether they are in Egypt or Syria or as citizens of the United States, right? So it's about denying Muslims the right of self-determination. It's racialized in the sense that if you are from a group that looks Muslim, you can be accused of being a closet Muslim even if you're not a Muslim at all. I mean, again, Denise Spellberg's book is excellent. Thomas Jefferson was accused of being a closet Muslim, right? And so these accusations there's a reason, it has a cultural resonance, the accusation of being a closet Muslim, that I think, again, maybe it's probably true also with Catholics, right? Because of the idea of the papacy and a universal church. And that reinforces certain kinds of theological rivalries that religions, particularly salvific religions, have. And there's too much, there's no time we're out of time. But I do think we can't equate anti-Muslim bigotry with anti-Catholic bigotry. I think, unfortunately, anti-Muslim bigotry is much deeper. Ultimately, Catholics and Protestants ultimately share the same tradition, right? But there is the historical view as Islam and Arabs being in the Schmittian sense, the paradigmatic enemy, right? And I think it needs to be discussed.
Yes, thank you. It definitely needs to be discussed. And that reminds me to remind you that we have our 24th annual conference, the CSID annual conference with MPAC, next month, May 15, here at Georgetown University DC campus. Of course, you are all invited to join us. It's an all-day conference, and we will have one panel on this exact theme that we are talking about today, about Sharia law and what Sharia law means, while 3 other panels will talk about democracy in the Muslim world and the role of the U.S. foreign policy in supporting, tyrannical regimes and oppressive, corrupt regimes. While we preach democracy, we are in fact supporting some of the worst regimes in the Middle East and the Muslim world. So please join us next month, May 15th, for our annual conference. We will continue the debate. Thank you very much to our excellent speakers today. I really learned a lot, and I hope that you have learned a lot also from these excellent scholars and speakers. And we look forward to seeing you. Thank you to the staff of MPAC for their help in organizing the event. And we have food for those of you who want to stay with us to continue the informal part of the discussion. So thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.